With example 6, we're going to examine changes to the selling price and its impact on the break-even point. A manufacturing company with fixed costs of $200,000 per year and variable costs of $500 per unit has a selling price of $750 per unit. The manufacturer is considering reducing their selling price to $700 per unit. A, how is the break-even volume affected with this price decrease? And B, compare the net profit before and after the price decrease at a sales level of 1,500 units per year. Let's take a look at part A. So how is the break-even volume affected when we reduce the selling price? Well, first of all, let's take a look at the current situation. Currently, our selling price per unit is $750, so we have $750 per unit times the number of units. Variable costs are $500 per unit, so we're going to subtract our variable costs of $500 per unit, leaving us with our contribution margin or gross profit of $750 minus $500, or $250 per unit times the number of units. Our fixed costs currently are $200,000 per year, so our fixed costs are not volume related, and so we'll put that here on a little bit to the right. Fixed costs are $200,000, and our net profit at the break-even point is going to be equal to $0. That's the definition of break-even, and so what that means is that our contribution margin must be equal to our fixed costs in order to break even. So the contribution margin must be $200,000 to yield a net profit of 0. There's the equation that you have to solve. You need to solve this equation for n. N is equal to $200,000 divided by $250, and n works out to a volume of 800 units. So we need 800 units in order to sell 800 units in order to break even. So now we can take a look at what happens when we decrease our selling price. If we decrease the selling price to, well, the selling price is going to go down to $700 per unit, so $700 per unit times the number of units. Our variable costs are not going to change. Our variable costs are still equal to $500 per unit times the number of units, which means that if we drop our selling prices, our contribution margin or our gross profit will also drop. In this case, it will be 700 minus 500, or $200 per unit times the number of units. From here, we also know that the fixed costs have no change, so the fixed costs remain the same at $200,000. And we also know that our net profit at the break-even point is going to be equal to 0 by definition of break-even, which forces our contribution margin to match our fixed costs of $200,000. So there's our equation that we need to solve for n. 200n is equal to $200,000, so n is equal to $200,000 divided by 200, or 1,000 units. So now what that means is that in order to break even, we have to sell 1,000 units before we start to see a profit. In other words, we have to sell 200 more units per period to break even, or 25% more in volume. In part B, we're going to compare the two scenarios using sales volume of 1,500 units per year, so n is equal to 1,500 units in both cases. Under the current scenario, we've got sales at $750 per unit times 1,500 units, so that would mean 750 times 1,500 units, and variable cost would be 500 times 1,500 units. Leaving us with a contribution margin of $250 per unit times 1,500 units, and that amount works out to a figure of $375,000. From the $375,000 contribution margin, we deduct our fixed costs of $200,000, leaving us with a net profit of $175,000. Now let's see what happens when our selling price decreases. Our selling price is going to decrease to $700 per unit. So our new sales revenue is going to be $700 per unit times 1,500 units. leaving us with sales revenue of a smaller amount of money. And our variable costs have not changed. They are still $500 per unit times the 1,500 units. And what ends up happening is our contribution margin has decreased from $250 per unit to $200 per unit times 1,500 units. And this is the number that's important, because this number, 200 times 1,500 units, is $300,000. So you can see that by decreasing the selling price of your product, you've actually decreased your contribution margin. You have less money with which to pay your fixed costs. Your fixed costs are still $200,000. They haven't changed, leaving you with a net profit of $100,000. So your net profit has decreased from $175,000 to $100,000 with sales of 1,500 units. Decrease in net profit is never a good thing.